Hey, and welcome back to another video. In this video, we're going to be adding the respawn function as well as the brake lights function to the parent vehicle. So with that, let's get started. So we're going to open up the parent vehicle, and then in here, we're going to create a new function, and this function is going to be the brake light function. And then on the brake light function, in the details, make sure the thing is selected. We're going to add a single input, and then we're going to call this braking question mark. I'm going to leave it as a boolean, and then from the braking pin we're going to drag off, and then we're going to look for select float, and then we are going to go and check out the values that we have. So for the tutorial series, I am using the automotive materials. It is a project, a free to download project. I will leave a link to it down in the description. It has a lot of materials for vehicles that you can use. And then if you want to add the materials from there to your project, then once you open up the automotive materials project, what you do is select the folder, and then here it says migrate. If you select it, and then it will ask you what you want to migrate, and then if you press OK, and then it will ask you where you want to migrate it to, and then that's how you will get it into your project. And the reason I say that is because I'm going to be using all the naming conventions from this material project. So from here, we go materials, we go exterior, and then the one I'm looking for is in the lights, the lamp red. So we're going to use in the light, these are the terms that I'm going to use, the facing intensity and the edge intensity. We can see here, these are the values that we have. It's 10 and 1. And then we head back here, we set B as 10. I'm only going to be using the facing intensity, and then we're going to set the A to 100. So this is pretty much if you are braking, and then it's going to select it to 100, and then if you're not braking, it's going to set it back to 10. And then just above the select float, we're going to right click, and then we're going to get mesh, scroll all the way down, select the get mesh, and then from there we're going to drag off and then get material index, and then the index, the material slot name we're looking for me it's going to be, let me just go back to the cars vehicle, let's say the ZR1, open up the skeleton mesh, and then the slot I'm looking for where the lamp red is the brake light. So we're going to be looking for the brake light, and then from mesh drag off again, and then we're going to get material, and then from the return from the material index we're going to drag that into the element index, and then from the mesh we're going to drag off, and we're going to go for create dynamic material instance, connect the get material to the source material, and then in the element index we're going to use it from the get material index. Then we're going to connect the execution bin, just going to add a couple redirect nodes here. And then from the create dynamic material instance return value, we're going to drag off, and then we're going to look for set scalar parameter value, and then we're going to take it from the set float return, drag that and set it to the value, and then the parameter name that we're looking for me it's the facing intensity. Make sure that it is spelled exactly the same as the material name. Then I'm just going to add a couple redirect nodes here again, just to kind of tidy things up. And then that is it for the brake light function. Compile, save, add to the event graph. And then where the brake input is, we're going to drag in the function. And then where we trigger the brake, we're going to connect that to the brake, and then we're going to say it's true. And then we're going to take the brake light function, Control D to duplicate it, and then we're going to connect that to the bottom part by the completed, and then we're going to set it to not true. So that's it for the brake light. I'm just going to compile and save, and then go and test it out to see if it works. Add to the workshop, save all. So we can see that the brake lights do in fact become brighter, and then go back to normal once you let go. So the brake lights work. So now we're going to add the respawn function. To do that, we're going to head to the level, content, inputs. We're going to right click, inputs, input action. This is going to be IA underscore respawn. I'm gonna open this, and then we don't have to do anything in here. So just save that, close it, open up the IMC imports, inputs, not imports. Then we're gonna add a new mapping, and then this is going to be the respawn we just added. Open up, click the keyboard. I'm gonna use R for respawn. Save this, close it, and then back in the parent vehicle, find an empty spot. I'm gonna put it here beneath the interact. So we're gonna right click, then we'll look for the respawn enhanced action events. So below the enhanced input action, we're gonna right click and then get actor location. We're gonna drag off from there, then we're gonna add, and then we're gonna use the Z. I'm gonna set it to 5. So what this is going to do is it's going to get the location of the car, and then it's going to add 5 to its location, and then that's where the car will be respawned. You can set this as high or as low as you want to just by altering the Z plus 5 or whatever value you want to add over there. Beneath the add, we're going to right click and then we're going to get actor rotation. On the return, right click and then split strut pin. And then from the add, we're gonna drag off and then we're gonna look for make transform. Select the rotation pin, right click and then split strut pin. We're gonna take the Z and then connect it to the Z as well. And then from the return value, we're gonna drag off and then we're gonna promote this to a variable. We're gonna call this spawn location, connect the execution pin, and then we're gonna drag off from there and then we're gonna look for set actor transform. And then on the new transform, we're going to expand this by right clicking and then split strut pin. Then we're going to drag in the spawn location, hold control, drag it in. I'm going to select this as well and then split strut pin. Then we're going to take the location and the rotation, plug that in. And then just above the set, we're going to right click and then we're going to add a custom event. And we're going to call this race spawn. Connect that as well to the set actor transform. So we're going to be calling this custom event whenever we interact with a race event because we're going to have reference locations to spawn the player and the AI. So we need an event that we're going to call where the interact collision box is and where the player will spawn will probably be two different locations. Not to mention there needs to be an offset to some degree between the player and the AI so that there's no collisions during the spawning process. So then we need to tell it where the player needs to be spawned. So that's also why we have the variable, because this variable will also be used to tell it where to spawn the car in connection to its designated spawn location, whether that be a scene component or a sphere, but we do need to tell the player's car to move from the box collision where it overlaps with the race event to trigger the event, and then it needs to move to a different location when the race starts and it's competing against the AI. And then we're gonna select the teleport, set this to true, and then beneath the set actor transform, we're gonna right click, then we're gonna get mash, and then we're gonna drag off from there. I'm gonna set physics angular velocity in degrees. We don't actually need to do anything with that. This is just gonna make it so that when the car is either spawned at the start location for the event or when something happens to the player and we need to respawn the car, that the car is respawned at a stationary motion. And then once again from the mesh, drag off and look for set physics linear velocity. And then this one yet again, we're not going to do anything with it. And then that will be it. So we're going to compile and save. And then we're going to go check to see if the respawn functionality works. We're going to play the level. Actually, wait, let me kind of exaggerate this a bit. Instead of 5, we're going to make this like 20. Let's compile, save, add to workshop, play the level, exit workshop. Just there go. And then as you can see, the car gets respawned. Fun thing is you can actually make the car kind of levitate. You quickly spawn the button. That is it for the two functions for this video. And that brings us to the end of this video. And until the next one.